It was a chilly evening in the quiet town of Millfield, a place known more for its sleepy streets than for drama. This was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of small-town life. Evelyn Shepherd, a 76-year-old widow with an open heart and gentle smile, had lived in Millfield her entire life. She was known for her warmth and kindness, her knack for baking the best apple pie, and her gentle but unwavering spirit. She had been the backbone of her family for decades, pouring her energy into raising her children and later, doting on her grandchildren. But as the years went by, Evelyn began to notice a shift in her family dynamics. Visits grew shorter, calls became infrequent, and it seemed that her grandchildren were increasingly distant. Although she longed for more time with them, she knew everyone had their own lives to live. She loved her family deeply, refusing to dwell on the loneliness creeping into her heart. She filled her days by helping around town, volunteering at the church, and chatting with her friends and neighbors, always making sure to give more than she ever took. She was, in every way, an ordinary yet extraordinary woman whose life revolved around her family and community. One chilly evening in early December, Evelyn received an unexpected phone call from her oldest granddaughter, Lily. "Grandma, we're planning a little family get-together tomorrow night," Lily said in a rushed tone. "It's been too long since we all gathered, don't you think?" Evelyn's heart warmed, and she quickly agreed. She spent the entire night preparing her famous apple pie, her excitement growing as she imagined the laughter and warmth of a family reunion. She dressed carefully, wearing her favorite blue sweater, and with pie in hand, waited eagerly for her son to pick her up. But instead of her son, Lily arrived, seeming preoccupied as she ushered Evelyn into the car, barely acknowledging the pie. The drive was quiet, with Lily speaking only in brief, clipped sentences, as if she were distracted. Evelyn, who was naturally sensitive to the emotions of those around her, sensed that something was off. But she didn't press. When they arrived at her son's house, she noticed how cold and distant her family seemed, as if they were uncomfortable in her presence. Conversations happened around her, with few words directed toward her. She tried to ignore the sinking feeling, clinging to the hope that they were simply tired or stressed. As the evening wore on, Evelyn noticed her family stealing glances at her, exchanging brief, almost guilty looks. She brushed it off, hoping it was her imagination. But after dinner, something unexpected happened. Her son, usually a warm and chatty man, took her arm and led her outside under the pretense of getting some air. Evelyn assumed he wanted a quiet moment with her, perhaps to share something personal. But instead, he led her to the end of the driveway, handed her an envelope, and without looking her in the eye, said, "Mom, we think it's time you moved on. You've had a good run here, but things are different now. We've arranged something more fitting for you." Evelyn's heart raced as she opened the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a brochure for a distant senior living facility. It wasn't just any facility. It was in another state, far from Millfield, and everything she had ever known. She looked up at her son, confused and hurt, struggling to find her voice. What are you saying?" she finally stammered. Her son's expression hardened. "It's what's best, Mom. We're all very busy, and you'll have more people to look after you there. It's time to stop clinging to the past. You'll be taken care of." His words, cold and impersonal, shattered something deep inside her. She had dedicated her entire life to raising him, to being there for him and his children, and now they were ready to send her away like an unwanted possession. With her heart heavy, Evelyn tried to reason with him, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I've always been here for you, for all of you. I love this town. My friends, my home, they're here." But her son simply shrugged, avoiding her gaze, and with a mumbled, "It's what's best," he turned and walked back into the house, leaving her standing there in the cold. She watched as the door closed, a sense of finality washing over her. She felt numb, her mind reeling as she tried to process what had just happened. She clutched the brochure, the edges digging into her hands, her thoughts spiraling. The family she had loved, nurtured, and supported had turned their backs on her without a second thought. Feeling lost and abandoned, Evelyn began walking down the street. It was late, and the streets were deserted, the cold air biting through her sweater. She hadn't dressed for a long walk, expecting her family to drive her home. But now she found herself alone, with no idea where to go. Her mind raced, memories flashing before her eyes. Birthdays, holidays, small, intimate moments spent with her family. She had always believed that love would be returned with love, that kindness would be met with gratitude. But here she was, left on the side of the road like a discarded item. As she wandered, her thoughts shifted from confusion to anger, a quiet, simmering rage that grew with each step. How could they do this to her? How could they look her in the eye and tell her that she was no longer welcome in the life she had built, in the family she had created? She felt the weight of betrayal settle into her chest, a painful, suffocating feeling that left her gasping for breath. And yet, beneath the anger and the hurt, there was a spark of something else, determination. She may have been abandoned, but she was not defeated. Evelyn was a survivor, a woman who had lived through more than her family could ever imagine. She had endured loss, hardship, and heartache, and she had come out stronger each time. And this, she realized, would be no different. She wouldn't let them define her, wouldn't let their cold indifference be the end of her story. The walk back to town was longer than Evelyn anticipated. The cold nipped at her skin, and each step seemed heavier than the last. Her heart pounded with a mixture of betrayal and an unexpected resolve. Evelyn, who had always thought of herself as a gentle, quiet person, felt a spark ignite within her, a stubborn, resilient force pushing her forward. She was no longer just Evelyn, the grandmother, the widow, the one who baked pies and showed up to every family event without question. She was someone who had been hurt deeply but was still standing. The thought fueled her, even as her feet began to ache and her breaths grew visible in the biting cold. Eventually, she found herself in the middle of Millfield, surrounded by familiar buildings and streets that were almost comforting. These places were her true family. Every shopkeeper, neighbor, and friend in Millfield knew Evelyn as the kind woman who lent a helping hand and always had a smile to spare. But as she wandered through the town square, she realized how desolate it felt in the dead of night. Shops were closed, and not a soul was in sight. The chill seeped into her bones, and fatigue tugged at her, urging her to find a place to rest, to give in to the weight of everything she had experienced. But something held her back. She couldn't allow herself to simply give up and collapse. Not here, not now. With nowhere else to go, Evelyn decided to head to the old bridge on the edge of town. It was a place she hadn't visited in years, but in her youth it had been her sanctuary, a quiet place where she could collect her thoughts away from the pressures of life. When she finally arrived, she found herself a spot under the bridge, shielded from the wind. She hugged herself tightly, sinking down onto the cold ground, and felt a tear slide down her cheek. She hadn't cried in years. She had always been the strong one, the one who took care of others, who never let life's disappointments break her. But this, being left out in the cold by her own flesh and blood, cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced. As she sat there, letting the darkness and loneliness wash over her, she heard a sound, a faint, shuffling noise coming from nearby. Startled, she looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light under the bridge, and noticed a figure slowly approaching. It was an older man wrapped in a worn, tattered coat, his face weathered and kind despite the lines of hardship etched into his skin. He walked with a slight limp, and a well-worn backpack hung from his shoulder. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern, clearly surprised to see her there. "Mom, are you all right?" he asked in a gentle voice, his eyes scanning her face as though he could see the pain lingering there. Evelyn nodded, though she knew she looked anything but fine. There was something about his presence that felt comforting, a quiet strength that reminded her of days long past, when people cared about each other without expecting anything in return. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "I'm fine. Just needed a place to think." The man, who introduced himself as Caleb, nodded knowingly. He seemed to understand that she didn't want to explain, didn't want to reveal the humiliation she had just endured. Instead, he sat beside her, silently offering his companionship without prying. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, the cold wrapping around them like an uninvited guest. After a few minutes, Caleb broke the silence. "You know, life has a funny way of bringing us to places we never thought we'd end up," he said softly, staring out into the darkness. "I was once a soldier, you know. Spent years fighting for things I believed in. Came back, and the world had moved on without me. Lost my job, lost my family, lost everything, really." He chuckled, though there was no joy in it. "Now here I am, just another face people pass by without a second glance." Evelyn listened, feeling a pang of empathy for this man who had lost so much and yet found a way to keep going. His story mirrored her own pain in a way she hadn't expected. They were both people who had given everything they had, only to be forgotten and discarded by those they loved. She glanced over at him, her heart softening. "I'm sorry," she murmured, feeling the weight of her own loss mingling with his. "It seems we've both been left behind." They shared stories that night, tales of love and loss, of lives filled with quiet resilience and unexpected hardship. Caleb told her about the family he hadn't seen in years, the daughter who had moved on without him, the wife who had left when times got tough. And Evelyn, in turn, found herself sharing bits of her own story. The family that had once been her whole world, the grandchildren she had loved and cared for, who had now abandoned her as though she were a burden. It was a release she hadn't known she needed, a chance to voice her heartbreak to someone who understood without judgment. As the night wore on, Caleb offered her a bit of his food, a small, meager portion of bread he had managed to save. She hesitated, feeling the weight of her own pride, but hunger and gratitude won out, and she accepted his offer. They shared the bread in silence, and for the first time that night, Evelyn felt a flicker of warmth, not from the food, but from the simple act of kindness between two strangers brought together by fate. By dawn, a plan had begun to form in Evelyn's mind. She realized that she couldn't return to her old life, that things had changed irrevocably. But maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to rebuild, to create a new life for herself on her own terms. She glanced at Caleb, who was dozing beside her, his face peaceful despite the hardships he carried. She admired his resilience, his quiet strength in the face of so much loss. She realized that she, too, could find that strength within herself. When Caleb stirred, she thanked him sincerely, expressing her gratitude not only for his kindness, but for the reminder that she still had the power to shape her own destiny. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think it's time for me to stand up for myself. For too long, I've been defined by what others wanted me to be. Maybe it's time I decide who I am." Caleb nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I think you're right, Evelyn. Sometimes life gives us a push we don't expect, but that's when we find out who we really are." They parted ways with a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect, each taking a piece of the other's story with them. As Evelyn made her way back into town, her heart felt lighter, and her mind was clear. She was no longer the broken woman her family had left behind. She was someone with purpose, with a fire within her that refused to be extinguished. And as she walked through the quiet streets of Millfield, she knew that her story was far from over. As Evelyn made her way back into town, the first rays of morning sunlight began to illuminate Millfield. The familiar streets, bathed in a golden glow, seemed to welcome her as though they knew her pain and yet silently encouraged her resolve. Evelyn had lived here her entire life. These streets, the people, the shops, all held memories of a life she had built with her own hands. And now, with her family gone, and her old life crumbling, the town was all she had left. She drew strength from it, from the faces of the shopkeepers she'd known for years, from the benches she'd sat on during her evening walks, from the memories she held dear. She felt as though the town itself was saying, "We see you, Evelyn. You belong here." By the time she reached the heart of town, Evelyn's exhaustion from the long, cold night had turned to a kind of fierce determination. She wouldn't let this be the end of her story. She would show her family, and maybe even herself, that she was more than the person they had discarded. As she wandered, lost in thought, she heard a voice calling her name. She turned to see Grace, the owner of a local cafe and an old friend from her younger days. Grace was a few years younger than Evelyn, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that had only softened with age. She ran her cafe with a firm hand, but had a heart as big as her voice was loud. She noticed Evelyn's weary look and immediately invited her in for a warm cup of tea. Evelyn hesitated, then allowed herself to be ushered into the cafe. Grace, sensing that Evelyn needed more than just a quick chat, led her to a quiet table by the window, away from the morning customers. She brought over a steaming cup of tea and a fresh scone, setting them down in front of Evelyn with a look that brooked no argument. Evelyn smiled weakly, grateful for the warmth and the familiar comfort of Grace's presence. "What happened to you, Evelyn?" Grace asked softly, concern etched into her features. Evelyn looked down at her hands, still holding the teacup for warmth, and hesitated. She hadn't planned on sharing the story of her abandonment with anyone. The shame and pain were still too fresh, and she wasn't sure she could bear to relive it. But as she looked into Grace's kind, understanding eyes, something inside her broke, and the words came tumbling out. She told Grace everything, from the cold, distant way her family had treated her at dinner, to the brutal moment when her son had handed her the brochure for the senior facility, to the long, lonely night she had spent under the bridge with only Caleb's kindness to keep her company. As Evelyn spoke, Grace listened with a quiet intensity, her face growing angrier with every word. When Evelyn finally finished, there was a long silence between them. Grace took a deep breath, clearly struggling to keep her anger in check. "That's it," she said finally, her voice firm. "We're not going to let them get away with this. You've given everything to your family, Evelyn, and they threw you away like you were nothing. Well, they're about to learn just who they've messed with." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the strength in Grace's words. She had always known Grace was a force to be reckoned with, but this fierce loyalty took her by surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up for her, to rally by her side. She had prepared herself for solitude, for facing this new reality alone. But here was Grace, ready to fight for her without a second thought. Grace leaned forward, her voice low but full of conviction. "I know people, Evelyn. People who know how to get things done. You don't have to go through this alone. You have friends here who care about you, who won't stand by and watch this injustice. We're going to make sure your family understands the consequences of what they've done." Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of gratitude and the faintest glimmer of hope. She hadn't felt this kind of support in a long time. For years, she had put her family's needs above her own, believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to keep them close. But here, in the face of their betrayal, she found an unexpected ally in Grace. She didn't know exactly what Grace had in mind, but she trusted her friend's determination and grit. Over the next few days, Grace worked tirelessly on Evelyn's behalf, pulling strings and calling in favors from people she knew around town. Word began to spread about Evelyn's situation, and as people learned of the betrayal she had endured, an undercurrent of sympathy and outrage grew within the community. People who had known Evelyn for years, who remembered her kindness and generosity, felt a deep sense of injustice on her behalf. Millfield was a small town, and word traveled fast. Soon, everyone knew what had happened to Evelyn, and the community began to rally around her in ways she could never have anticipated. But Grace had more than just sympathy in mind. She had a plan. With the help of a local attorney, she began looking into the legal aspects of Evelyn's situation, exploring ways to challenge her family's actions. It turned out that Evelyn still had certain legal rights that her family hadn't considered. The attorney explained that the family's attempt to force Evelyn into a facility without her consent was not only unethical but possibly illegal. With Grace's encouragement, Evelyn began to understand that she had more power than she realized. She could stand up for herself, demand her rights, and refuse to be cast aside. Meanwhile, Caleb, the kind stranger who had kept her company under the bridge, also became a part of Evelyn's support network. He would visit her at the cafe each morning, bringing a sense of quiet strength and calm that Evelyn found deeply comforting. Caleb, who had once been abandoned by his own family, understood Evelyn's pain better than anyone. He encouraged her to stay strong, to fight for herself, and to never lose sight of her worth. As the days passed, Evelyn's resolve hardened. She was no longer the meek, quiet woman who had been left out in the cold. She had found a community of people who believed in her, who saw her value even when her own family had failed to do so. She began to see herself not as a victim, but as a fighter, and with each passing day, her confidence grew. Then a letter arrived in the mail. It was from her family, or rather, from a lawyer representing her family. The letter outlined their intentions to move forward with placing her in a senior facility, citing concerns about her well-being. Evelyn read the letter, her hands trembling not with fear, but with anger. How dare they continue this charade? How dare they try to justify their betrayal as concern for her well-being? It was the final straw. She knew she had to make a stand, not just for herself, but for every elderly person who had ever been treated as an inconvenience, as a burden to be shuffled away. With Grace by her side, and the support of the community rallying behind her, Evelyn decided to confront her family. She would call a town meeting, a gathering where she could publicly address the situation and lay bare the truth of what her family had done. It was a bold move, one that would require every ounce of courage she had, but she was ready. She would no longer be silenced, no longer be cast aside. On the morning of the meeting, Evelyn dressed carefully, choosing a vibrant blue dress that matched the strength and determination she felt inside. As she made her way to the town hall, she was joined by Grace, Caleb, and a group of neighbors who had come to support her. The crowd grew as they walked, people joining them along the way, all of them there for Evelyn, ready to stand by her side. As they arrived at the town hall, Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was her chance to reclaim her voice, to show her family and herself that she was not a woman to be cast aside. She was a fighter, a survivor, and today, she would make sure her story was heard. The town hall was packed. Word of Evelyn's story had spread quickly, and the people of Millfield had shown up in force. Evelyn could see the faces of familiar friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by her plight. At the front of the room, her family sat with uneasy expressions. Her son, William, glanced around nervously, clearly unprepared for the overwhelming support Evelyn had garnered. Beside him, her grandchildren avoided her gaze, their faces reflecting a mixture of discomfort and guilt. They had come thinking this would be a quiet, private meeting, expecting Evelyn to be alone. Instead, they were met with a room full of townspeople who had come to witness the truth unfold. Grace, ever the fierce ally, stood beside Evelyn as she took her place at the front of the room. The quiet murmurs that had filled the hall faded as Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was her moment, and although she felt a surge of nerves, she knew she had to do this. She had spent too long living in silence, hiding her hurt and putting others' needs above her own. Today, she was reclaiming her life. Evelyn took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each person who had come to support her. "Most of you know me. You know I've lived in this town my whole life. You know that I've tried to give back, to help my family, to be there for those I love. But recently, I learned that sometimes the people you love don't always love you back the same way." There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd, people shifting uncomfortably, glancing at her family with thinly veiled looks of disapproval. William's face reddened, but Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength. I trusted my family with everything. I raised them, I cared for them, and when they needed me, I was there. But last week, I was left on the side of a road in the cold, handed a brochure for a facility hundreds of miles away from my home, from my friends, from the life I built here. My own son, her voice caught for a moment, but she forced herself to continue. My own son told me it was for the best, that I needed to move on. The room fell silent, a tense stillness filling the air as the weight of her words sank in. She could see the shock and outrage on the faces of her neighbors, could feel their empathy and anger swelling in support of her. She felt a flicker of strength, bolstered by their presence. I thought my life was over that night, she admitted, her voice softening as she remembered the pain of that dark, lonely walk. I thought maybe I was no longer needed, that perhaps I really was a burden. But then I met a man named Caleb. She gestured to the back of the room, where Caleb stood quietly, his presence a silent support. A man who has faced his own share of loss, of abandonment, and he reminded me that my worth doesn't come from how others see me, but from the life I've lived and the love I've given. At this, a few people in the crowd clapped softly, and Evelyn felt her confidence grow. She looked directly at William, her son, who shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. William, she said, her tone firm but not angry, I don't know what I did to make you think I deserved to be abandoned. I don't know what went wrong that made you think I was no longer part of this family. But what you did, what all of you did, was wrong. And today, I'm here to tell you that I am not going anywhere. This is my home. These people, she gestured to the crowd, are my family too. And they deserve to know what kind of person I am. They deserve to know that I am someone who will not be silenced. William opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't done yet. I trusted you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I trusted you to be there for me, the way I was there for you. And when you left me on that road, you didn't just break my heart. You broke a promise, a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. But I am not broken. I am here, and I am stronger than you ever gave me credit for. At this, the room erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the walls as people stood, clapping and cheering for Evelyn. Tears filled her eyes, but she held her head high, feeling a sense of pride and empowerment she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had been afraid to stand up for herself, afraid of what others might think. But now, surrounded by people who believed in her, who saw her worth, she felt unbreakable. As the applause died down, Grace stepped forward, her expression fierce. Evelyn is not alone, she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. This town has seen her kindness, her dedication, her loyalty. And we will not stand by and let her be treated this way. We are her family. We are her community. And we will support her, no matter what. The crowd cheered again, and Evelyn felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She was not alone. She had a family right here, a family that saw her, valued her, and loved her. And as she looked out over the room, she saw the shame on her family's faces, the guilt in their eyes. She could tell that they hadn't expected this. They had thought they could discard her quietly, that she would simply fade away. But they had been wrong. Evelyn wasn't going anywhere. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Evelyn's stand spread throughout Millfield. People rallied around her, offering their support and kindness in ways she hadn't anticipated. Neighbors brought her meals, friends stopped by to chat, and strangers sent her notes of encouragement. The town became her sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild her life on her own terms, surrounded by people who genuinely cared. But the impact of her confrontation went even further. Her family, faced with the public backlash, began to experience consequences of their own. William's business, once a respected establishment in town, saw a decline in customers as word spread about his treatment of his mother. His reputation, built on a carefully crafted image of success and respectability, began to crumble under the weight of his actions. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, and his family's social circle grew smaller. The community, once supportive of him, had chosen to stand with Evelyn. In time, William reached out to Evelyn, seeking a conversation. She agreed, not out of a desire for revenge, but because she wanted to hear his side, to understand why he had done what he did. When they met, he looked worn, his once confident demeanor replaced with a kind of quiet humility. He admitted that he had felt overwhelmed, that he had seen her aging, and had feared the responsibility of caring for her. He had acted out of selfishness, out of a desire to simplify his own life, but he hadn't anticipated the hurt he would cause or the strength she would show. Evelyn listened, her heart aching but resolute. She forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. She would not allow his actions to continue to hold power over her, but she made it clear that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, that their relationship would need time, effort, and trust to heal. William agreed, visibly humbled, and they parted on tentative but hopeful terms. In the months that followed, Evelyn flourished. She found new purpose in her community, volunteering at local shelters, organizing events for the elderly, and even reconnecting with people she had once known only in passing. Caleb, her friend from that dark night, remained by her side, becoming a constant source of support and encouragement. Together, they shared their stories of resilience with others, helping those who felt discarded or forgotten find strength and purpose again. Evelyn had found a new family in Millfield, one built not on blood, but on shared experiences, mutual respect, and unwavering support. She had lost so much, but she had gained a life of her own, a life defined by her choices, her strength, and her courage. And in the end, she knew that she had finally reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her place in the world. She was no longer just a grandmother, a mother, or a widow. She was Evelyn, a woman who had faced abandonment and risen above it, who had transformed her pain into a powerful testament of resilience. And as she looked out over the town she loved, she knew that she would never again be silenced. Months passed, and Evelyn found herself thriving in ways she never could have imagined. Her days were filled with purpose, each morning bringing new opportunities to engage with the community that had become her lifeline. She had transformed her pain into passion, dedicating herself to helping others who had experienced similar abandonment or loneliness. With Grace's support, Evelyn founded a small organization that offered companionship, resources, and advocacy for the elderly in Millfield, particularly those who felt isolated or unvalued. She named it Silver Ties, a symbol of the bonds that could be formed even in the later chapters of life. Silver Ties quickly gained traction, attracting volunteers from all around town. People of all ages came forward, inspired by Evelyn's story and her newfound mission. It became a safe haven for those who had been cast aside, and soon, Evelyn found herself not only offering guidance, but also learning from the wisdom and resilience of others. The organization held weekly gatherings where people shared stories, laughter, and sometimes even tears. These moments of shared vulnerability and support reminded Evelyn of her own strength and solidified her purpose. What had once been her greatest pain had now become her greatest joy. Meanwhile, Evelyn's family remained on the outskirts of her life. William, after their last conversation, had kept his distance, respecting her need for space. Her grandchildren occasionally sent letters, small gestures of apology or updates on their lives, but Evelyn maintained a boundary. She needed to heal on her terms, to be fully herself before she could let them back into her world. She had spent too much of her life compromising herself for others. Now she was determined to prioritize her own well-being and happiness. One sunny afternoon, as Evelyn was preparing for a Silver Ties meeting at the local community center, she received an unexpected visit from Grace. With her usual brisk energy, Grace walked in with a local newspaper under her arm and an excited glint in her eye. "Evelyn, have you seen this?" she asked, unfolding the paper to reveal an article on the front page. The headline read, "Local Woman's Fight for Dignity Inspires Change in Elderly Care." Beneath it was a picture of Evelyn, taken at a recent Silver Ties event, her face alight with joy and determination. The article detailed her story, her advocacy work, and the impact she had made in the community. As Evelyn read, tears filled her eyes. She had never sought attention or recognition. Her only goal had been to help those who had felt the same pain she had. But to see her efforts acknowledged in this way was overwhelming. Grace squeezed her shoulder, her eyes brimming with pride. "You deserve this, Evelyn. Look at what you've done. People are taking notice." And indeed they were. The article sparked a wave of interest from surrounding towns, with people reaching out to learn more about Silver Ties. Other communities expressed interest in starting similar programs, inspired by the work Evelyn had done. It was as though her voice, once stifled and disregarded, had finally found the platform it deserved. However, the article also caught the attention of William and his family. For the first time, they were confronted with the reality of Evelyn's strength and the community's support for her. William reached out again, this time requesting to attend one of the Silver Ties meetings to see her work firsthand. Evelyn was hesitant, unsure if she was ready to have him intrude upon this part of her life. But after much consideration, she decided that allowing him to witness the life she had built without him might serve as a lesson more powerful than any words she could say. When William arrived at the next Silver Ties meeting, he was visibly nervous, his posture uncharacteristically subdued. Evelyn greeted him politely, offering a nod but nothing more. She was no longer the woman who would bend over backward to appease him. She was simply Evelyn, and she would not compromise her values for his comfort. As the meeting began, William watched as Evelyn interacted with the group, her compassion and strength evident in every word she spoke, every hand she held, every smile she shared. He listened as she addressed the room, speaking about the importance of self-worth and resilience, about finding purpose even in times of despair. She spoke of her journey, of the pain and betrayal she had endured, but she did so without bitterness. Her words were filled with hope, with an invitation for others to rise above their hardships and find joy again. For the first time, William truly saw his mother, not as the woman who had always been there for him, but as a person with her own story, her own strength, and her own life beyond him. After the meeting, he approached her, his face a mixture of guilt and admiration. "Mom," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I didn't realize. I didn't understand everything you went through. I was so focused on my own life, my own responsibilities, that I forgot. I forgot to see you." Evelyn looked at him, her expression gentle but firm. "William, I'm glad you're starting to understand. But this isn't about you coming here to feel better. This is about you recognizing that I am a person with a right to my own happiness and respect. I hope you can see that now." He nodded, visibly humbled. "I want to be a part of your life again, Mom. I want to make amends, if you'll let me." Evelyn considered his words carefully. She felt no need to rush, no pressure to grant forgiveness immediately. She had learned that her time, her peace, was her own. "We'll see, William," she replied, her tone steady. "Actions speak louder than words. If you truly want to be in my life, you'll need to show me through the choices you make, the respect you offer, and the kindness you show, not just to me, but to everyone around you." Their relationship would take time to mend, but for the first time, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope that it could be possible, as long as he respected the boundaries she had set. She was no longer willing to compromise her dignity, no longer willing to accept anything less than the love and respect she deserved. And if he couldn't meet those standards, she was prepared to walk away. In the weeks that followed, William did make an effort, slowly rebuilding his relationship with her through small gestures of respect and understanding. He volunteered at Silver Ties, helping with events and getting to know the people who had become like family to Evelyn. He listened to their stories, gaining insight into the struggles of the elderly, understanding the impact of neglect and abandonment in a way he hadn't before. Through this experience, he began to truly grasp the pain he had caused his mother, not just by abandoning her, but by failing to see her as a whole person. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued to thrive, her work at Silver Ties expanding beyond Millfield. People from neighboring towns visited to learn from her, and soon she was invited to speak at larger gatherings, sharing her journey and inspiring others. She became a symbol of resilience, her story resonating with anyone who had ever felt undervalued or dismissed. She spoke not just of survival, but of the power to transform pain into purpose, to find strength in oneself even when others failed. One evening, as she stood in front of a crowd at a nearby town, she ended her speech with a simple message. "Life is full of unexpected changes," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We may face moments of betrayal, of loneliness, of hurt, but those moments don't define us. What defines us is how we rise after the fall, how we find our own voice and our own purpose. And in doing so, we realize that our worth comes not from what others think of us, but from who we are and who we choose to become." The audience applauded, moved by her words, and Evelyn felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had come so far from that cold, dark night when she had been left on the side of the road, abandoned by the people she had loved most. But now she stood on her own, with a community behind her, a mission ahead of her, and a life that was truly her own. Evelyn had become more than a survivor. She was a beacon of hope, a testament to the strength that lies within each of us. And as she looked out over the crowd, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace, knowing that she had finally reclaimed her story. As Evelyn's influence and impact grew, so did the ripple effects of her story, reaching beyond the boundaries of Millfield. People began to write letters, sharing how her journey had inspired them to stand up for themselves, to reconnect with estranged family members, or even to seek forgiveness from loved ones they had wronged. Evelyn became known as a woman of quiet resilience, a symbol of strength and compassion. Her story resonated with countless people, especially those who had felt discarded or unappreciated in their later years. Silver Ties, once a small local initiative, blossomed into a regional movement, with chapters sprouting in nearby towns, each following Evelyn's example of dignity, empathy, and mutual support. The increased attention led to an invitation Evelyn had never expected. A prominent senior advocacy group from the state capital reached out, inviting her to speak at a statewide conference on elder rights and well-being. The invitation was a remarkable honor, and Evelyn found herself both humbled and overwhelmed. She wasn't accustomed to such attention, having spent most of her life in the background, content with quiet acts of kindness and service. But she realized that this was an opportunity to give voice to not only her experience, but also the experiences of so many others who had suffered silently. Her story could be a catalyst for change, not just in Millfield but across the state, and perhaps even beyond. Evelyn accepted the invitation, and when the day of the conference arrived, she traveled to the capital with Grace and Caleb by her side, their unwavering support helping to calm her nerves. As they reached the convention center, Evelyn was taken aback by the size of the audience. Hundreds of people filled the room, from advocates and healthcare providers to family members and seniors who had come to hear her story. The magnitude of it all was overwhelming, yet Evelyn felt a deep sense of purpose settle over her. She reminded herself that this wasn't about her. It was about every person who had ever felt left behind, every person who had been made to feel invisible. When Evelyn took the stage, the room fell silent. She began by sharing her personal journey, her voice steady, but filled with emotion as she recounted the night her family had abandoned her and the long, painful path to self-discovery that had followed. She spoke of the betrayal, the sense of worthlessness that had haunted her, and the struggle to find herself in a world that seemed to have moved on without her. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and she saw people nodding, wiping away tears, or holding the hands of loved ones beside them. She had touched something raw and powerful, a shared experience of vulnerability and resilience. Then Evelyn shifted her focus, speaking not just of her own experience, but of the broader issues that affected the elderly and vulnerable members of society. She highlighted the need for respect, dignity, and support for seniors, challenging families, communities, and institutions to do better. She called for stronger community programs, legal protections, and a cultural shift that would honor the elderly for their contributions and wisdom. Her words were not accusatory, but they were firm, a rallying cry for change. She urged the audience to consider how they treated the older members of their communities, reminding them that aging was not a loss of worth, but a testament to a life lived and wisdom gained. As she finished her speech, Evelyn looked out over the audience, her heart pounding with the weight of her words. "I may have been left behind by those I loved, but I am here now, standing tall, because I found a new family in my community. I found strength in myself and in the people who believed in me. And I want every person in this room to remember that no one should ever be made to feel alone or unwanted. We are all connected, and we owe it to one another to make sure that every person, young or old, feels valued and respected." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted long enough to bring tears to Evelyn's eyes. She had not expected such an overwhelming response, but in that moment, she knew that her story had resonated with people on a fundamental level. She felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment, knowing that her words had made an impact, that she had given voice to the silent struggles of so many others. She stepped down from the stage, where Grace and Caleb were waiting, their faces beaming with pride. They hugged her, congratulating her on the powerful speech that had moved so many people. Following the conference, Evelyn's life continued to evolve in ways she never could have anticipated. Silver Ties expanded statewide, with other towns and cities adopting the model she had pioneered in Millfield. Evelyn became a beloved figure in the senior advocacy community, a woman who had transformed her personal pain into a powerful movement that sought to protect and uplift others. She traveled to different communities, speaking at events, meeting people who had been touched by her story, and offering guidance to new Silver Ties chapters. Her days were filled with purpose, her work providing her with a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Yet, even as her advocacy work grew, Evelyn never lost sight of her roots. She remained deeply connected to Millfield, where her story had begun, and where the people she considered her true family lived. Every Sunday, she hosted a gathering at the community center, where people of all ages came to share stories, laughter, and companionship. Caleb, who had become like a brother to her, was always there, offering quiet support and wise counsel. And Grace, her ever-loyal friend, continued to be by her side, helping to manage Silver Ties and organize events. One evening, as Evelyn sat with Caleb and Grace, reminiscing about the journey they had all been on together, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed. She had started as a woman who had been cast aside, broken and alone. But she had emerged from that dark night under the bridge with a newfound sense of purpose, surrounded by people who had seen her worth when her own family hadn't. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, reclaiming her dignity and transforming her pain into a beacon of hope for others. Evelyn's story became a legend in Millfield, a testament to resilience and the power of community. People spoke of her as an inspiration, a woman who had not only survived a great betrayal, but had used it to create something beautiful, something lasting. Her journey reminded others of the importance of compassion, the strength of the human spirit, and the value of every individual, regardless of age or circumstance. As the years passed, Evelyn continued her work with Silver Ties, mentoring new leaders and watching the organization grow beyond anything she had imagined. She had found a second family in her community, a network of people who supported and cared for one another. And in this family, she had found a joy and fulfillment that filled the space her biological family had left behind. William and his children had gradually re-entered her life, but on her terms, and with the understanding that she would no longer tolerate disrespect or disregard. Their relationship had been rebuilt slowly with honesty and mutual respect, but Evelyn knew that her happiness was no longer dependent on anyone else's approval or acceptance. One day, as she sat in her favorite spot in the town square, surrounded by familiar faces and the vibrant hum of life in Millfield, Evelyn found herself at peace. She had not only reclaimed her own life, but she had also created a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. Silver ties would endure as a reminder of her resilience, a testament to the power of love and community. And Evelyn knew that, in the end, she had not only survived her darkest night, she had turned it into something beautiful, something that would inspire others for generations to come. As she looked out over the town she loved, Evelyn felt a deep gratitude for every moment, every hardship, and every joy that had brought her to this place. She had found herself, her purpose, and her strength, and she had left a lasting mark on the world, a reminder that no one is truly alone, and that even the most ordinary person has the power to change lives, to make a difference, and to be remembered, not for the trials they endured, but for the strength and grace with which they rose above them. Evelyn's life had become a story of triumph, of compassion, and of the indomitable human spirit, a story that would live on in the hearts of those she had touched, a legacy of love and resilience that would shine brightly for years to come.